If you look at the question why so many competition authorities are under pressure and their independence is under pressure, you'll very quickly come to merger cases, indeed. And indeed, if you look at the merger guidelines and the revision, and you see that the question is put, what can merger control do for digitalization, sustainability, jobs, growth, resilience? Well, you see immediately that this context is not an easy one. So these and other matters we would like to discuss today under the chairmanship of Ingrid Vandenborre. Ingrid, you and your team have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping the microphones are working. Thank you. I'm very honored to be helping organizing our merger control discussion this morning. As President Munthe said, it's an evolving landscape of merger control enforcement. Before we start, let me introduce our very honored panel. We'll start with, on my left, very far left, the chairman of the Japan Fair Trade Commission, Chairman Chatani. So very welcome here, Mr. Chairman. He's been in office since May of 25, and previously was the Administrative Vice Minister of Finance in Japan. To my right is Commissioner Elisabetta Iossa from the Italian Competition Authority. She's also Professor of Economics at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, and she's a research fellow with the Center for Economic Policy Research and Bocconi University, and has been providing input and advice to numerous antitrust authorities, including the EC, the UK authorities, and the UK Financial Services Authority. I also have Dr. Ingo Brinker with us, who many of you will know. He's partner at White & Case Düsseldorf, and is a chairman of the Association of the Study of Antitrust Law, which needs no introduction, I think, in Berlin, in this jurisdiction. To his right is James Keyte, partner at Boies Schiller. He's a trial lawyer with many years of experience, but many will know him as a director of the Fordham Competition Law Institute, and he's for many years also taught comparative antitrust law. And last but not least, to my left, former chief competition economist at DG Conf, done 16 to 19, currently professor of economics at Imperial College Business School in London, and adjunct professor also at the Norwegian School of Economics, as well as director of the Center for Economic Policy Research. So very happy to have this panel here for discussion with us this morning. Let me just start and set the scene a bit. There is, as we mentioned, an evolving landscape of merger control enforcement, and I think the main challenge is reconciling traditional competition objectives with what we have come to see as broader industrial and policy objectives. We've seen the Draghi report, obviously, some time ago, and there's been quite some debate as to how that gets implemented in competition and merger control enforcement. I did want to start this discussion with a transitional question from the last panel. We've heard about the independence of enforcement, competition law enforcement. I want to bring that to the merger control front and seeing if that and how that applies to merger control authorities. So I will start with James to ask, when we ask about independence under pressure, how do you see that for merger control authorities? I think that's a good transition for us.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Andres. As someone who puts on a conference in New York, you do a much better job. So I am learning how to put on conferences even in my 13th year. I thought the panel before was excellent to bring in these issues, and we'll relate it a little more to mergers. And part of the question is, especially from the U.S., is the sky falling? Well, it's very dark and it is very cloudy. And we see this a lot in the merger space. Things are different, and they're different in many ways. They're different because broader values are coming into play, whether they're industrial policy, whether they're trade, whether they're dynamic competition and competitiveness. That's one thing, and we see that obviously in the CMA more officially. We see with the Draghi report in Europe. In some sense, ours may be more ephemeral in the US, given personalities. But part of that is having different voices. I've been involved in the past. Certainly lobbyists have been involved in the process in the US, but it's usually later in the process. It's usually attached to some value, some conception of an antitrust theory. It's not ad hoc for the most part, and it's the notion of kind of private capture that's always going to be there, but typically not driving things. And so I think the risk in the US on the independence is with respect to the norms that we expect. That Bill highlighted the trust, and we aren't used to, if you don't like this decision or you're not letting enough people play in the sandbox, you get fired. This is not a norm, even though it certainly may be within the power of the executive. So I think the jury is kind of out about whether this will be kind of, even within this administration, how permanent it will be, and certainly future administrations. You know, we do have the Tunney Act for DOJ consent judgments, where a judge has to go through that, and it'll be interesting to follow that. We also have the state AGs that continue, you know, they can independently go after mergers, but it is different. And for those of us who started in the 1980s with the Chicago School and the Consumer Welfare Standard, and then, you know, it was kind of dull. It certainly is not dull anymore, but it's very serious in terms of whether we can maintain the trust in our agencies, and whether there's a coherent theory and philosophy that can bring predictability or retain predictability in the area.
Yeah, and we'll delve a little deeper, but I wanted to ask Commissioner Iossa for some from the European side, the Italian side. Do you see it as well as an issue?
Yes, thanks. So first of all, thank you to President Munt for putting together such an amazing conference and for the invitation. I think it all boils down to really a few key words: consistency, as James has said, predictability, legal certainty, and for us in Europe also internal markets, which is something very important. The consistency has been already emphasized, but we know that competition policy leaves, a competition law leaves a margin of discretion, and having a technical approach to issues and to cases is really what helps to ensure consistency, and consistency is key for predictability. And of course, business needs as much as possible legal certainty in order to make their long-term investment decisions. So that kind of legal certainty can be enhanced also by that technical approach. Let's also recall that governments, by definition, have a short-term views because they seek re-election and their mandate is short. So the independence is also helpful for a long-term perspective, which at the end of the day is the perspective of competition policy. In Europe, independence is also a driver, a necessary condition for the internal markets. I recall that the ECM Plus directive in 2019 introduced the provision of in legal autonomy, political autonomy, because otherwise national competition authorities could be tempted to pursue national interests, protectionistic interests, and favor national state companies vis-à-vis others. And of course, this could undermine the internal market. Yeah. So this gives an additional reason why autonomy and independence is key. Let me say that in Italy, we have financial autonomy, which I think is very important. We also have a provision that not only makes us not renewable, which I think is also very important. We cannot be dismissed, and for 5 years after our mandate, we cannot be appointed in any other authority. This is also a way to sort of avoid any revolving door within the public sector, and I think this is quite important.
Yeah, very interesting. And it's a good segue into our main first topic, which is around the evolving purpose of merger control, because of course that independence also creates a tension with how we look at merger control going forward. We've heard the Commissioner Ribera indicate in implication also of the Draghi reports that we have to look at how European companies would face global monopolies, and she reassured the European audience that the merger control rules that are currently under revision, and we'll see a draft still this spring, I think, will give companies support to and find it easier to achieve positive scale, she said, to compete with global monopolies. So clearly there is something seeping into merger control enforcement that is taking on a broader kind of potentially political objective as we see these developments. I want to raise maybe the first question to Chairman Chatani, yes, to ask if there's also a concept of national champions under Japanese competition law. If you could comment on this a little bit.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the kind invitation to the 23rd International Conference on Competition this year. I very much look forward to engaging in frank and meaningful discussions with all participants at this significant gathering today. And with regard to your question, the JFTC fully recognizes that as globalization has progressed and international competition has become increasingly intense, there has been growing demand for mergers between domestic firms aimed at strengthening international competitiveness. However, we do not adopt the view that merger control should be generally relaxed for the purpose of creating so-called national champions. While protecting particular firms or industries may yield certain short-term effects, in the long run, it risks undermining innovation and sustainable growth. Competition policy is intended to secure interests of general consumers and to promote the democratic and wholesome development of the national economy. Through fair and free competition among firms, it enhances overall economic welfare, including through the creation of new innovations, and ultimately supports sustainable economic growth. In this context, where international competition is in fact active in particular goods or services, and customers choose between domestic and foreign suppliers without distinction, we define the relevant market on an international basis and conduct our competitive assessments accordingly. We also give full consideration to competitive pressure from overseas firms. Thus, even in cases where the merging parties hold high shares in the domestic market, we assess the transaction based on actual competitive conditions. This approach is consistent with that adopted by major competition authorities in Europe and the United States and reflects internationally accepted standards.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. How would you comment on the role of innovation then in assessing competition law implications in Japan?
On this point, the JFTC recognizes that the universal role of competition policy is to remove obstacles to fair and free competition and thereby create an environment in which innovation can flourish. Based on this understanding, at the end of January this year, we published a policy document entitled Proactive Development of Competition Policy for the Promotion of Innovation. In this document, we reaffirmed our commitment to advancing competition policy with a clear objective of promoting innovation. In order to create an environment conducive to innovation, we believe that close dialogue with a wide range of stakeholders, including enterprises, startups, academia, and consumers, is essential. Through such dialogue, it is necessary to fill the gap between regulations and practical work by accurately understanding the actual state of competition in each field, and to promote a competitive market environment that encourages innovation by enhancing predictability for enterprises. Some view innovation and the prevention of foreclosure as incompatible. However, we do not see them like that. On the contrary, we believe that healthy competition is what encourages firms to take on challenges and provides the foundation for innovation. At the same time, innovation itself reshapes markets by introducing new products and services, thereby influencing the future structure of competition. In this sense, competition and innovation are mutually reinforcing. Finally, to create a genuine foundation for innovation, strict enforcement against violations of competition law. The GFTC conducts its enforcement activities under the principle of no competition, no growth. Ensuring competition is a precondition for sustainable growth, and we believe it is ultimately the most reliable way to support innovation.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman Chatani. If I can maybe turn back to the Commissioner for a comment. In combining or harmonizing these policy objectives, we hear very traditional technical antitrust enforcement continuing in Japan. We did see in Italy there were call-in powers introduced, of course, that were broadening jurisdictional review by the Italian competition authority in cases that may raise substantive issues. Would that be a basis to consider that some of these new policy objectives could find their way into Italian competition law enforcement, or how do you see these policy objectives potentially evolving in the enforcement phase?
Okay. Let me answer by taking a step back and look and share what is the view that I think we should take, which is a really broad view, going back to maybe less than a year ago, where in most panels we were talking about evidence that was brought to us by a number of academics and economists on the rise in concentration in most sectors, mainly in the US. But Tommaso Valletti also contributed to see whether the same could be said about Europe. And although in Europe there has not been the same degree of increasing concentration, there have been signs as well in some countries of market structure turning more to oligopoly. So less than a year ago, we were in panels talking about, oh, have we been under-enforcing, not over-enforcing competition law? And I think this should be the starting point. Then came the Draghi report. And the Draghi report put emphasis to the innovation gap, the productivity gap that was that needed to be addressed, and at the end of the day needs to be addressed because innovation is a driver for growth, and growth is in a sense what helps preserving democracy and the European model. But I don't see in the Draghi report a call for weakening competition policy. In fact, if you look also at the chapter dedicated to competition policy, you see that he calls for the new competition tool with remedies, structural and behavioral remedies applied to market investigation, and he calls for a scrutiny of mergers that fall below the threshold for compulsory notification. Also, what I see from the report is that generally it takes a very sort of a standard approach that economists will share, which is to say that you have to try to address the problem through a mix of policy tools. Some are supply-side policy tools, other are demand-side policy tools. So the latter will try to pull innovation through, for example, public procurement, and that's a proposal of archetype kind of projects, which are being, in a sense, discussed in Europe. And just a few days ago, there was the Industry Acceleration Act that goes in that direction, and a number of supply-side tools, which instead are there with a view to make it easier for companies to innovate through sort of a better education, better training, venture capital market, financial incentives, and so on. And of course, competition is a supply-side tool that is complementary to any kind of industrial policy, and that is a tool to sort of also lead to that innovation and growth. And let us recall that in Europe we have a beautiful Article 3 of the treaty that says competition is the tool to achieve the social market economy that is at the base of our European model. It's an economy for a balanced and sustainable growth. So in that regard, I will totally agree with the fact that competition is a tool and is there to actually contribute through a complementary approach to innovation and growth. We may go more into the detail, but let me now go back to your question. So what about powers and mergers, in a sense? So when we start discussing about enlarging policy objectives, taking into account of other priorities, sustainability or resilience, I really went back on what the law says and what the sort of merger guidelines say. And I could not really find anywhere in the guidelines something that says that merger control should be confined to price parameters. In fact, non-price parameters can enter the market definition, the competitive assessment, and the remedies. Of course, these are non-price parameters that matter for competition. So not just non-price parameters regardless of competition is, because the view is always to go back to consumers' purchasing decisions and what matter for those consumer purchasing decisions. So in Italy, we scrutinized mergers where there was a company producing a green product in the household sector, and we did ask ourselves, does it matter for consumer purchasing decisions? Should we define a narrow market only for green products? Where is the competitive pressure coming from? And the more these things matter for people, the more it naturally enters the competitive assessment. And I think the merger assessment is sufficiently flexible that as the consumer preferences evolve, we can use that in the assessment. Should we really go beyond that? I mean, if I think of resilience, and I'm very glad that Martin Peitz is here and Massimo Motta and people who, from the academia who immediately clarified certain dynamics and effects. But again, resilience is an aspect that could naturally enter our assessment, in the sense that when we make our competitive assessment, we do ask whether there is competitive pressure coming from and what is the kind of market structure. And we know that resilience is facilitated by plurality of suppliers and reliable suppliers. And naturally, if there is a supplier that is not reliable, perhaps also because of a risk of interruption in supply chain, this is something we can naturally take into account. Should we go beyond that? I think the issues have been emphasized today already says that there is a risk for the independence and the autonomy of institution, but I really also do not see any advantage to this. And I go back to one final point, which has been already made, for example, by President Benoit Courret. But again, economists will look at tools and they will ask ourselves, if I want to achieve a certain objective, what is the best tool that I should use? And for sustainability, there are lots of tools have been discussed, credit, subsidies for clean research, and so on. And the same could be said for safety or other considerations. But when it comes to price control, what is the best tool? We really have two tools, competition or regulation. So giving up a tool so important as strong enforcement will inevitably cause a gap that is going to call for more regulation later on. So I think the way we've been interpreting, our mandate is technical, and it should remain technical because it's really what the theory and the empirical facts tell us we should do.
I think it's very helpful. I mean, the way you sketched it, I think it's clear. It's a false contradiction, right? To say we have the policy objectives on the one hand and competition law enforcement on the other. No one is, I think it's wrong to think we're going to get those policy objectives achieved through weak competition law enforcement. You mentioned non-price factors. I may want to add like our time horizon. That was also is a factor to look at how do we look at time horizons to achieve competition effectively, to achieve some of the innovation benefits. It's another element. I wanted to go to Professor Valletti and maybe to ask a bit of a more provocative question, having heard the Commissioner, to ask, have merger decisions to date looked enough at the positive implications of mergers for innovation and for achieving scale and the benefits of scale? Have we had positive impact? Because I think there's always a question, we can live and work with the existing merger tools, but have we looked enough on both sides of what the merger can achieve, both perhaps in terms of price effects, but also in terms of scale and innovation?
Sure. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's a fantastic conference. I will answer perhaps tangentially first, but I want to start from a comment that Peter Freeman made in the Q&A before, when Peter said, you need to be able to tell in 10 seconds in the morning news when you have a good case what the case is about. I will complement that by saying to do that, you need to have a good case. So the problem, the current problem of the enforcers, we're subject to more, say, political pressure, not to say interference, and since, by the way, I have no conflict of interest, I should say that, I don't do any consulting, so the US, the UK, Perfidious Albion, when I'm also based, and to some extent also DG Comp. These are the three enforcers which are most subjected to political interference. They've not been running cases, interesting cases, for a while. So there can be lots of seminars, lots of... so what do you talk about in the radio if you're not running a case? And this brings back the question about accountability and the legitimacy of those institutions that can go very wrong. So I am actually reinvigorated when I see instead some excellent member states which are running good cases, they are pushing the boundaries, they try, and they roll up their sleeves and they do cases. So enforcers not running cases are not a good thing to observe. Let me go to mergers. And again, when we talk about mergers, we need to start from Draghi. Draghi, and I differ from Elisabetta, actually gives a wonderful political window of opportunity for further consolidation in Europe, especially via mergers, and especially in some sectors, such as telecoms. Great window of opportunity, which I strongly disagree with. So how do you do that? How do you give this window of opportunity? Via efficiency, via big is beautiful, via scalability. You name the buzzword that you want, and then you get there. So efficiency in certain parts of the competition law bubble, to me, as an external observer, is like teenagers talking about sex. So everybody talks about it. Most claim it's happening. And the evidence is not there. Okay? So this is similar to that, to some extent. Again, I need to be provocative and live.
Yes. Thank you very much. That was a big ask of this panel.
Yeah, and the same thing about efficiency. So efficiencies, if I have to think about the evidence that we have evidence that actually some concentration may help, moderate levels. All the drastic innovation, the radical innovation comes from small and especially young firms. There is ample evidence in economics, and I can say, so where is the evidence that merger-driven efficiencies have been achieved by firms which are already very large and dominant. What is that? What is that? Show me the evidence. This evidence does not exist, and it calls to the contrary, in fact. So mergers, and I will stop for now, provocative enough, is the last line of defense when it comes to competition policy. So these are the tools that we use. Why do I say the last line of defense? Because once concentration is achieved, once market dominance is attained, it's very difficult to undo it. It's very difficult to unscramble the eggs. It's almost impossible. I'm not in the US, but think about Live Nation Ticketmasters just a few days ago. That's a horrible experience. That's a horrible experience. That shouldn't happen anywhere, okay? But it tells you that even excellent cases where there was ample evidence of something going wrong, etc., it's very difficult to undo that. So you need to prevent that from happening. And I'll stop here.
Okay, I will give you one reaction, and then we'll turn it back the next round. But I did want to say, to the suggestion that there's no evidence of big being helpful or effective or efficient or scale being a tool, I would refer to investments in AI, right? There are many European companies that simply do not have the scale to invest sufficiently in AI. That needs a big framework, needs a big structure, but that's not the only sector, right? There are many structures where even if you don't have network effects, you need scale. But let's reserve it for some of the next rounds. I'll ask others to comment as well. Mr. Brinker, can I start with you for any comments on maybe Professor Valletti's sort of provocative statements? It doesn't have to be quite as provocative, but we can have a debate.
Yeah, it's a kind of a déjà vu, because many years ago, Andreas, we had Christina Cafara on the panel, and I had to speak after her. And at that time, I said it's always difficult to speak after Christina. And Tommaso, I think it's probably very true to say the same about your intervention here. So, well, first let me thank Andreas Monte, the president of the Bundeskartellamt, not only for inviting me personally, but inviting so many of the members of our association. I think it's a great opportunity not only to participate, but also to exchange views, to contribute to this truly unique conference, and simply to stay in contact to discuss these very topical questions here. And the members of the Studienvereinigung are extremely grateful that we can be here. And if I may extend my thank to Alberto Pera, because to pick up what Professor Monti has said, we certainly have not the privilege of the authorities to collude among the associations of competition lawyers and economists, but we also try to get a little closer and collaborate and then take advantage of our respective experience. And that's what we have been doing over the last couple of months and years. And Alberto is clearly evidencing this European spirit in which we are trying to proceed with the various associations around Europe. So coming to your question, I apologize for seizing the opportunity to thank Andreas Mund in particular. I think what is I think quite important, and you picked it up, Ingrid, already. It's certainly necessary to have a case-by-case review and approach to things. Scaling up is clearly a buzzword, as Tommaso has said. On the other hand, and we have heard this yesterday, both from Mr. Höttges and also from Mr. Obermann. There are certain areas where I think it's more than fair to say that Europe is not really competing eye to eye with, in particular, the US, but also other parts of the world. So there is a need to scale up, to become bigger. I do not wish to say that bigger is beautiful, but nevertheless, it's important to realize that when it comes to investment, and we are talking about these incredible amounts yesterday already, it's simply necessary to have the funds, to have the possibility, to have the incentive, and also a concept which drives not only competition but growth. Elisabetta has mentioned that already, and merger control can contribute to that. For a lawyer who is practicing in this country, it's fairly easy to say you can distinguish between the more competition-related review and the perhaps political influence, because we have an institutional framework for that. So the Bundeskartellamt has the privilege of reviewing cases on the merits, with economic evidence and competition-related considerations, and we have this extraordinary instrument of the permission to be granted by the Federal Minister of Economic Affairs, who can take into account many other considerations. But having said that, I think also in the context of the authorities, European Commission, Bundeskartellamt, the French authority, all the others, I don't see a contradiction if it comes to innovation, the consideration of innovation, also mergers which may lead to innovation or shall lead to innovation, that you take this into account. It's not only, and I'm just echoing what has been said before, it's not about only price effects and more technical questions, it's also about these further considerations, which of course, and that's also important, we have to stress that it's not only a political question, it's also a technical question, that we have to identify the right procedure when it comes to evidencing that there are advantages not only to competition but also to innovation. It's not simply done by saying, okay, there will be innovation and therefore there will be further growth. Of course, this has to be evidenced, which is from time to time very difficult. On the other hand, when it comes to the discretion, which has been discussed before, also in the panel before us, I think the authorities may be encouraged, and I would strongly support this concept, may wish to consider that markets are dynamic, and a static review of cases is certainly not helpful. So what may be helpful in the future is to take this dynamic character of the markets of competition a little more into account. Also coming back to what Professor Harvard has said this morning, when we talk about the Constitution, it's of course about the rule of law, it's about the judiciary, but it's also, as Professor Monti, I think, said, it's the trust in the people, the trust in the business, that they are able and willing to work together, also to become bigger in order to enhance competition, in order to enhance growth in the markets. And that's another topic. This is not to suggest that I would promote any sizing down of a strict review of merger cases. However, taking dynamics, trust in the business, and also the dynamic character in particular of the markets into account may be a thing which can be improved in the future. Thank you.
Very helpful, thank you. And I think we're all looking for decisions, indeed, that make that more explicit, right? Because I think in many instances, authorities may say, we've taken all of that into account, including the efficiencies, including positive effects, including, so there's no dichotomy, but we're not seeing that necessarily in all the decisions. I wonder, James, if it's different from a US perspective.
Yes, well, if you think of, if the subject is evolving purpose of merger enforcement and policy, the U.S. is just an intellectual whiplash in the last few years. It seems like the neo-Brandeisian view of merger enforcement is ages ago. Now things have happened so quickly in the last year, but certainly with Lena Khan and Jonathan Kanter and the neo-Brandeisians, it was not so much an evolution as wanting to go back to the 64 guidelines, I think 64, 68, but to a structural approach, structuralism, in a sense, anti-oligopoly as a prophylactic measure without kind of a technocratic effects analysis. This very much influenced the 2023 guidelines, which are quote based on case law, but all the case law is based on from the 60s, and so it's not really based on a more modern analysis. Now, when we go back to the Trump administration, we have this concept of populist conservatism, and big shrimp. I mean, you're not sure what that means, but on the populist side, you get this concept of America first, and when I love America, but America first is a notion of an antitrust concept. It's kind of hard to get your hands around. But what it appears to mean is protecting industry, It's a protectionist kind of view industry in the U.S. and this notion of industries going offshore and being hollowed out. And so that's going to be a priority. And it also appears to involve some notion of maintaining international dominance in industries. Now, how much of that can fit into true antitrust analysis of relevant markets and the notion of dynamic competition? Perhaps it can. Perhaps it's consistent, but not always. But then when you get to the populist conservatism part, then you get the conservatism part, which is a little more traditional. It's a hands-off approach. Yeah, monopolies are bad, especially if they're consumer-facing, but oligopolies, go at it. You do your analysis, and by the way, whether it's a legitimate basis or not a legitimate basis, we're happy to go in and fix things. I mean, you see this in the HP Juniper. Was that kind of a favor fix with this private capture, or did it really have some issues with respect to national security or future competition with China? And so, but certainly in the evolution or dialectic with the neo-Brandeisians, it's hands-off. It's not. It's inviting more mergers. And it's inviting a view of dynamic competition that is friendly to mergers because it is uncertain. And all of this falls with the fact that the U.S. case law controls, but that's only if you're going to court. Case law does not control in deciding what to enforce, and this is where this kind of whiplash of going back and forth has happened in the last few years.
Yeah, and of course you don't have decisions that spell out as much as you have in Europe, right? In the US, it's much more intransparent.
Yeah, though I still think in Europe, it's like 7 years to get to the Court of Justice, and then they don't happen that often. But so.
Let's turn to our last topic, because I'm looking at the time as well. We're going to look a bit at traditional versus new theories of harm. So let me turn the question to Chairman Chatani on our next topic, which is basically looking at how the Japanese Federal Commission has adjusted and looked at digital markets, for example, which is really the bulwark of where these new theories of harm emerge.
Yes. Thank you. Turning to mergers in the digital sector, the JFTC recognized the need to respond appropriately to their specific characteristics and therefore revised its merger guideline in 2019. In that revision, we clarified our analytical approach to features commonly observed in digital markets, such as multi-sided market structures, network effects. In addition, one important tool in reviewing digital mergers is the collection of internal documents from the merging parties. In order to conduct a prompt and accurate merger review, it is essential to establish a precise understanding of the relevant facts. This is particularly important in digital markets where conditions evolve rapidly. We need to understand the parties' intentions and objectives in planning the merger, as well as how they anticipate the transaction will affect consumers, competitors, and other stakeholders. Internal documents can be highly useful for this purpose. The GFTC has publicly clarified examples of the types of internal documents that may be requested. Furthermore, we have adopted a proactive approach to seeking information and comments from third parties. In Japan, when a merger proceeds to the Phase 2 review, it has been standard practice to invite comments from third parties. However, particularly in digital markets, where market conditions are complex and rapidly evolving, the potential effects of a merger are often multifaceted and wide-ranging. In such cases, in order to accurately assess the competitive impact, it may be necessary to gather diverse information from a broader range of stakeholders. Therefore, in such cases, we may invite third-party comments as necessary, regardless of whether the case proceeds to the Phase 2 review, so that we can collect the relevant information and reviews from an early stage of the review process.
Thank you very much, Chairman Chatani. Could I ask you to comment briefly on whether this concept of killer acquisitions in this context has come up in Japan as well?
Yes, thank you. With regard to startups and so-called killer acquisitions, the GFTC recognizes that even small firms may possess competitively significant assets such as data or intellectual property and may have substantial potential competitive strengths that is not immediately reflected in their current market share. In Japan, merger notification is generally required when certain thresholds based on the party's domestic turnover are met. However, in recent years, concerns have been raised that digital platform operators may acquire small startups that do not meet the notification thresholds, yet whose acquisition could nonetheless raise competition concerns. To address this issue, the GFTC revised its merger review procedure policy in 2019. We clarified that we may review a transaction where the total value of the consideration is substantial and the transaction is expected to affect domestic customers. In addition, we have stated that companies planning a merger that is expected to affect domestic customers are encouraged to consult with the GFTC. Such companies include those planning acquisitions in which the total value of the consideration exceeds 40 billion Japanese yen and the target company has business operations located in Japan. We have also established an online information submission form relating to mergers. In increasingly complex market structures, this mechanism is intended to enable us to capture a broad range of information concerning transactions, including so-called killer acquisitions, as well as other mergers that fall below the domestic turnover notification thresholds but may nonetheless affect competition in Japan. At the same time, in the context of a shrinking domestic market, Japanese firms are actively using M&A to improve efficiency and maintain competitiveness. The GFTC will therefore continue its efforts to enhance predictability for businesses while broadly collecting information on mergers and striving to conduct prompt and accurate merger reviews.
Thank you very much. Concept of predictability, of course, is important. Commissioner Iossa, to turn maybe to your perspective as well. Again, I mentioned the call-in powers earlier. NVIDIA Run AI is, of course, a killer acquisition kind of transaction. What are your views into how this has become more important, perhaps, in Italian competition enforcement?
Yes. Let me just say one word to react to what Ingo said about scaling up. So in a country like Italy, where 95% of companies are SMEs, of course, the issue about scaling up is important. But what we see as an authority, that the biggest barrier to scaling up remains the regulation and sort of fragmentation within the country and within Europe. So the best strategy to scale up is really to sort of strengthen the internal market and reduce those barriers. Every year we issue about 80 recommendations, advocacy reports to governments on precisely those kind of barriers. We also monitor what happened once we have intervened, and our success rate at the moment is very high, more than 67%. So I think that is an important contribution. With regard to dynamic effects, I think what Guillaume Loriot said, we need to have a case-by-case approach. We need to be rigorous and not speculative, maintaining that consistency and predictability. And I will leave to Tommaso to talk about the fact that inevitably we need to also take into account that unless there are synergies, it's very unlikely that a merger may have a positive effect on consumer surplus, even if you're in one of those cases where it has a positive effect on innovation. So, but again, the approach we take is a case-by-case one, and if there are guidelines by the Commission that may help to ensure consistency of applications across jurisdictions in how we sort of think of those efficiency defense, I think is very important. And I also want to say that it's also, to me, very important that we keep in mind the requirement of merger specificity, because we see in the authority a lot of situations where companies get together and they sign agreements where they join forces, for example, in order to make a joint investment or a joint R&D research. But it's an agreement, so we can intervene, and we do intervene to make sure that that agreement brings benefits of innovation or investment without restricting competition. So, you know, merger specificity is important. In terms of calling power and predictability, so what happened is, as I mentioned, in Italy, many companies are SMEs. A lot of innovation potential, as Tommaso said, is within these companies. So 3 years ago, we received a new power from the parliament that allows us to call in, so to sort of when a certain dimensional, temporal and structural conditions substantial conditions are met, to request a company to notify a merger. And then we apply our standard powers. We have used this power about 10 times. One was the case you mentioned on NVIDIA, which was a merger that was then referred to the Commission. There is now, there will be soon a preliminary rolling, so which I think will be very interesting. So I invite you to follow. There was another one in another innovative sector involving Honeywell. And the idea of this power is really to intervene in those circumstances where, even if you are all below the thresholds for compulsory notification, that can be a significant risk of an impediment to effective competition. Now, in our guidelines, we've tried to sort of inform the business sector as the conditions that may be relevant for us to exercise their power. Those guidelines were put on the public consultation, and they clarify that we can use this power both in traditional and in innovative sectors, but we will be extremely careful when the acquisition relates to a target that is an innovation hub, that is an innovative company that could, in principle, be also a nascent competitor. And I think this is important. Again, starting from research, we have seen that unfortunately many of these below threshold mergers have gone undetected in the past. That has been a problem in the digital sector, in the pharma sector. There is a lot of evidence of this. And we now also know that once that damage is done, it's very difficult to undo. I relate to all the debate about restorative remedies in the digital sector, and the difficulty to really restore competition only through cease and desist order, which implies that you have really to go back, especially when you have network effects or data acquired also thanks to sort of anti-competitive conduct. So I think it's not surprising when there is an enforcement gap that authorities find ways to fill it. And you've seen that this calling power has been now requested by a number of authorities in Europe, and those who have not yet received it are using other tools to fill the gap. And I refer to 101 and 102. Yep. And it's very important precisely because protecting innovation is key, and that innovation may really come from these SMEs and nascent competitors.
Okay. First Valletti, I will turn to you with another provocative question. Understanding sort of the importance of growth and the startups in Europe and all of the SMEs, how do we think about exit strategies? And what do those exit strategies entail, which are important to enable growth, economic growth, and a healthy economy, right? You need a vibrant economy. That means startups need exit strategies. I think Commissioner Ribera commented on that in her conference last week as well, to say we need to make sure our European startups have exit strategies. I know it's a new question, so you don't need to comment on it directly, but if it would be interesting to hear your reaction.
I'll first react to you pushing back on what I said earlier, so that
Yes,
I take an opportunity to push back on you,
Yes.
saying, what about this AI, what about this big is beautiful, etc., etc. So the practical debate, because we have to be pragmatic, is whether now in the new merger guidelines, should we have efficiencies at the start, or is it still part of the efficiency defense? This is the practical battleground. To change that, I want to remember the words of Carl Sagan, who was a great astrophysicist and legendary science commentator, that to say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay? So where is the evidence? There has been a single, but the systematic evidence to change procedure is such a big thing, the systematic evidence that a single merger block that the EU did not produce these amazing efficiencies in a counterfactual where the mergers had been achieved, okay? Alstom Siemens cannot be an answer to that because I can start, I was involved with that, and it's not a good case. Even the only one which would have been Amazon iRobot, I did research, not even that would stand scrutiny. And these are the very few mergers which have been blocked where there could have been some innovation. So where is the evidence to change dramatically this procedure? Now, when it comes to efficiency and investment and innovation, of course, it involves predictions. And predictions are hard, okay? It's not for sure. There are probabilities. And when predictions are hard, priors dominate. So economists underestimate that we are not anymore in an estimation game. This is what we thought. I'm going to estimate the likely impact of a price increase through some methods. With innovation, that's very, very hard. That's very hard. And instead, we are involved in this persuasion game. So what can I do to persuade you that actually there is no evidence that being big leads to more innovation, more efficiencies? What can I do? Think logically. Why is a firm innovating? Why? Because they want to get a better product, because they want to get a new innovation, they're going to capture market share from the rivals, they're going to grow bigger, they're going to be... That's the chain of causation. Because you innovate, you become bigger, okay? But people want to twist this around and say, because you're big, you are going to innovate more. What happened now? You are big, you are less subject to competition. Have you become nice all of a sudden? Okay. Do you take into account the well-being of people just because you're big and you want to give it back to society? It doesn't work like that. You keep innovating because there is somebody which is blowing on your neck, and if you don't do, you actually lose market share. Now, if all these efficiencies were leading, were there, etc., etc., again, it's a paradox, of course, but which country historically concentrated all production in a few plants? That's the Soviet Union. Okay? The Soviet Union would have won dramatically because of the super efficiencies. Of course, there were other problems that the Soviet Union had. They didn't think about that. Actually, you should talk to engineers. They are great. But also, when firms become bigger, there are these economies of scale coming from managing super big companies. They cannot be underestimated. Okay? So the evidence is not there. You asked me about the exit strategy. The exit strategy is again, I've written a lot on this topic. I've come to the conclusion that we should be, contrary to the current mantras, we should rein-storing because they are pragmatic, they are feasible, they are implemented, some structural presumption in merger control, where large dominant firms should not be allowed to buy anyone. They can do innovation by themselves, okay? Which doesn't mean that a small company doesn't have an exit strategy. The only thing, they shouldn't sell to Google. They may sell to Mistral. They may sell to someone else. It's not that they cannot be bought, because this is a twisting of words. Finally, on AI, again, has there been any merger which has been blocked, which has prevented concentration from arising? If anything, with AI, we are repeating the same mistakes of the past. We are allowing Google to integrate their own AI agent in search. We are allowing Microsoft to do the same in Teams. At least Italy tries to stop that when it comes to is it?
Meta.
Meta in WhatsApp, etc. They are trying. These are the smaller authorities. Otherwise, we are not doing anything. So where is it, the evidence which is calling in favor of loosening current merger standards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ted. So I will... I see looks at the other side of that.
Well,
so I just want to say...
I'll just say one thing. There is a thing called private property, and maybe the liberty to engage in transactions. But what I love, I don't think that Schumpeter and Arrow, I think they'd be very surprised that we're still debating. Should innovation be driven by, Schumpeter view that that yes, you need to continually actually capture the market in dynamic markets. They are not static. Whereas Ken Arrow, I think, like the view that smaller and more of them will be better for innovation. So it is an interesting question of what is the role of government, in a sense, ex ante regulation or enforcement in the context of dynamic markets with a lot of innovation. And so these are different views. I did want to say one thing about traditional versus non-traditional or novel theories. I don't think there really are novel theories out there. I mean, we have horizontal, we have vertical, we have raising rivals costs, we have portfolio effects. It's all been around. It's just different contexts, much more complex contexts. And I'll say in the US, part of the problem is the law is not very flexible when it comes to the effects must be probable, and the potential competition doctrine is very restrictive. And so I think for enforcement, at least in the US, for a lot of things that in the context of these future potential competition ideas, it does not match the law right now. And so these contexts make it very difficult to have enforcement actions in that space.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I'm going to ask
no applause,
you to...
but that's okay. Yeah.
We'll give you applause at the end. Well, I'm sure everyone's going to get applause. So I wanted to ask...
The U.S. a bit of a target.
So Brinker, to comment, I think we're fulfilling...
Quick comments.
Very quick comments,
Very
because
quick.
I think I'll tell people to hold their questions ready, because I think we're going to be ending at that point, looking at the time as well. I think we're fulfilling a role of defending a bit against sort of the, I would say, we don't want to limit exit strategies, right? I'm not saying there's no exit strategies, but what is the justification to restrict startups' exit strategies? That would be my immediate comment. I'm sure you have others as well. You should comment.
That's one of them.
Yes.
And, as you would say in English court, with all due respect, Your Honor, I strongly disagree. They are just to say what Ingrid has already stated. It's hard to see why, as a fundamental principle, these large companies should be prevented from acquiring startups or companies, which, by the way, are quite often started because they have this exit opportunity. So they should be able to do that. And if the large companies are probably the only ones who are able to pay the price for a great innovation, then they should be able to do it. Second point, this discussion quite often circles around the tech companies and digital. But if you have, for example, a focus on pharmaceuticals, it's also quite obvious there are simply research institutions, private or public, who bring about a very impressive innovation, but simply not able to market these kind of technologies. So there should be, and there will be, and there are many successful pharmaceutical companies in the world who are able to acquire this technology, and they, in my view, should be able to do so.
Thank you very much. With this, I think we should end. We're running a bit over, but I think we're still okay. Do we have time for a question from the audience, or should we? No. We should go on. Okay. So with this, I want to thank. I'm listening to the present for guidance, but with this, I want to thank all of the panelists for the good discussion. It was very interesting. I want to thank each of you. Thank you so much. Thank you.